Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of the More Than You See podcast, where I have meaningful conversations with creatives about their mental health journeys. Please note, I am not a licensed practitioner or therapist, but an actor and a filmmaker who is deeply interested in sharing my own struggles and exploring the mental health of others. My hope is that these conversations bring you some joy, some understanding, and some tools so that you can build your own mental health toolbox. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the podcast. This week, I have something really special. I have my friend on, Alan, who is a comic book expert, and I'm going to call him that, and you will see after this interview why I say that. And the reason why I wanted to have him on is because I believe that storytelling and mental health, and specifically comics, are hugely intertwined. Comic book characters were created both for entertainment, but also to explore what was going on in the world around the creators of these comics, as well as what their own inner struggles were. I feel like it was one of the most interesting ways that people started to explore their their mental health through these characters that they would bring to life. And Alan is an expert on both these creators as well as the characters that they've created. And so we have a really interesting conversation both about some of the characters in the Marvel and DC universe that you probably have heard of, like Harley Quinn, Superman, Batman, but also some lesser known characters that still explore some really important mental health topics through the characters that they have created. I hope that this podcast helps bring some greater enlightenment to the comic book world and also might encourage you to find your own comic book character that relates to whatever is going on for you right now in your life. Hi, Alan. How are you today?
I'm doing pretty well. How about you?
I'm good. I am really trying to encourage everyone to be as open and honest about like how we're actually doing and how we're showing up in the world this
Mm.
season. So I'm actually going to retract what I just said. I am doing good. I'm also feeling a little overwhelmed this weekend, and also very happy that it's the weekend. How are you actually doing?
I'm not overwhelmed, but more recently I was overwhelmed. So I'm very
Okay.
aware of the energy that took and where I'm at now. And there are things that are making me nervous for the next week. But I also know it's nothing, none of the situations are new. It mostly has to do with work stuff.
Mhm.
But then also because I have multiple friends right now going through tough times. And it's one of those things where there's a natural worry for about them, but I'm also adjusting how I worry because especially in high school and in college, I was sometimes wrongly, sometimes but I was usually put in the role of someone who could help fix things or help make people feel better and all,
Yeah.
which I'm happy to do, and I love doing that for friends. But at the same time, there was too much of that put on me when I was
Yeah.
much younger, to a point where it's one of those things where at the time it seemed natural, and then 20 years later, you look back and think, "Oh, that was kind of nuts."
That's important. It's important to recognize that in yourself.
Yeah.
Well, thankfully, I did not bring you on today to have you be my therapist. So you are off the hook.
Sure.
Um, I, brought you on today because I'm going to get into your background in a little bit, but I think storytelling is a really crucial way that we dive into our own human emotions, especially human emotions that we are unwilling to talk about openly in the world. And one of those big ones is, depression, anxiety, different mental illnesses. I think that more often than not, storytelling and storytelling throughout history has been the place where people have explored that, even if they're not willing to explore that in their day to day conversations. And you, in particular, are an expert, and I'm going to call you an expert on comics and comic book history and comic book characters and just the lineage and the context that comic books had and how much that explored different mental illnesses throughout history. And so I'm really excited to talk to you about how some of these, comic book creators put their own experiences into the characters that we now see on screen, and how we now can look back at those characters and see, their evolution just as we've evolved as a society, in looking at, the way that we show up in the world when it comes to mental health. So thank you for being here today. I am so excited to talk to you about this really important topic.
No, I'm absolutely happy to help. Again, like it's one of those things where I'm not just here to help friends, but I like to support everything. And I think you've been doing such wonderful work with this podcast. And if there's anything I can do to give anything to it, then sure, I'm more than happy to.
Well, I think that everyone's going to really love this episode. So, before we dive into the comic book side of things, do you want to just give everyone a very brief, like, why you got interested in comic books? Your own experience, if you are willing to share with your own mental health, like how did these two worlds collide for yourself and help you become the person that you are today?
Surprising no one, I was a nerd. And I remain a nerd. Now I'm able to be a nerd in a professional capacity. And so that's very lucky and helpful. Growing up, I very much had a sense of constantly where I was falling short. Looking back, a lot more things make sense now. There was certain identity issues I was dealing with even at a young age. There was ADHD, which was not properly understood by people in my life at the time, and so it was viewed that I had a discipline problem, and and that I just needed to buckle down and then it would be better. And there were just things of I had a tough time for a while finding my people. So there was bullying at school and fights and just flat out being called a freak because I enjoyed sports, but I had not a lot of competitive edge for it. If we lost a game, okay, but we got to play a game. That's cool, right,
Right.
guys? No, it was not cool. Apparently, it was not cool to have that attitude or to have days where you didn't feel like playing basketball or trying to get better where you felt like, just reading a choose your own adventure book or something. So yeah, there was a lot of that going on and I loved storytelling at an early age and I had fortunately my grandparents on my father's side lived pretty close to me and my grandfather and I would talk a lot about different stories and had he had not led an artistic life per se. He'd been an activist and worked in the labor unions, a major player in the AFL-CIO. When he died, actually, they named the training center after him. It was a very big moment for the family. But he loved the arts and he loved theater and he loved looking at the layers behind the thing and what can this be saying that can apply to different parts of life, like the story beyond the story. So I grew up that was a standard part of discussion, and we would, we would read some books together, and sometimes it would be just as simple of as, did the Hardy Boys really look at all the clues? Should they have looked for something more deeply? Or like, okay, well, that's how they punished that bad guy. Do you think that's the right punishment? Do you think that the bad guy could have benefited from and we would just have these discussions just to have them. I also had the benefit of a babysitter, Linda Rudd, who I still talk to, and who kind of became my big sister
Hmm.
and she was a huge sci-fi fan and fantasy fan, and eventually leading me into comics, where she took me to a convention. I won a door prize by chance, hear a bunch of comics, and I had watched cartoons, of course, so I knew who Spider-Man was and other characters, but seeing these stories, there are these extra bits that I didn't really see as much in the cartoons. I saw one of the characters I gravitated towards was Dazzler,
Hmm.
who is a Marvel mutant character, sometimes associated with the X-Men, introduced in the X-Men comics. And she is a hero, but really she wants to be a singer and be a performer. And eventually she sort of becomes a performer slash activist. I saw in those early stories her thinking, I've been trying a couple years to be a singer and I am technically singing, but I'm kind of broke and my dad still wishes I went to law school.
Mhm.
And my friends think maybe be better if I were a superhero, and I get that that's a compliment. They think I'm heroic, but also I wanna be a singer. And that was wowing me,
Mm.
or that, I was reading through a Spider-Man comic and just seeing his anxiety about, am I being a good enough nephew to my aunt? Like, have
Mhm.
I properly, I have all these activities, but am I properly repaying her for everything I've done?
Right.
And so I was really, I mean, as someone who was very aware of, like, oh, I am not on the path my parents wanted for me,
Mhm.
and who later just felt like, oh, I am flat out the black sheep. And by the way,
Right.
our relationship is much better now. Like,
Mhm.
I thankfully, through my own, like, couple of years of therapy, especially recently, um, took a lot of hard looks at myself, as well as my relationships with other people and what I've absorbed from other people, and EMDR, and lots of also just long, very earnest talks with several exes and several
Yeah.
friends who've known me for 15, 20, 25 years. So things are better now, but I feel like I still benefit from just seeing those struggles in any kind of storytelling, but in particular, superhero comics were for me a strong thing at a young age. And so and then when I was getting more into comics, it turned out, my grandparents knew Jack Burnley,
Mm.
who was he passed away several years ago, but he was a golden age artist, meaning he did comics back, in the era of the 30s and 40s and early 50s, and he was actually the first artist to put Batman and Superman on a cover together. He co-created the original character Starman, who's an okay character, but a later legacy character of him is a fantastic character.
Mm.
And Jack was so kind. I met him at a young age. He was so kind. He listened to all my, the story ideas you have when you're 8 or 9 years old, or
Right.
10, whatever I was. He also had these collections of comics, not the originals, but the bound reprinted copies, and he lent a couple of them to me, and through those, I also saw, "Oh, well, this Batman seems really dark, but then this story, Batman's much friendlier, and he's working with the police, and then this Batman is darker again, but he's also more full of doubt." And Jack wasn't an expert on comic book history by any means, but had worked in the industry and was able to say, like, yeah, so in the 30s and 40s, this is how we approached Batman and Superman.
Mhm.
And in the 50s, things changed. It was after World War II when the editors had a different idea of what should be, and parents now had concerns about what kids were learning from comics. So we changed Superman and Batman to this. And then in the 60s and 70s, it was mainly college kids reading. So
Mm.
we bring this up. And that, like, immediately, like, threw me into that track of not just wanting to know about the characters and their lore, but what did that come from? Who wrote this?
Right.
And is this because that event in history is happening? Like, is this how much of this story is because Vietnam is a thing? And how much of this story is because the artist lost their father at age 17? Like,
Right.
what and I wanted to know that, and that sort of expanded to storytelling in general.
Yeah. That's so fascinating. So, would you say that um, comics over time have become more censored, for lack of a better word, as far as their discussion of what's going on in the world? Like, do you think that in the golden age and before, the editors did not have as much control, and so they're like artists were really able to kind of share what they wanted, and now it's a little bit more controlled?
It's definitely more controlled now. In
Yeah.
terms of censored, it's a pendulum. It's sort
Mm.
of like television. It swings back and forth depending on who are the higher ups, but also on what they are trying to predict the audience will respond to. So, for instance, in if you look at television, American television, there are gay characters showing up in primetime television in the 70s, and some
Mhm.
of them are positive gay characters. And
Right.
there's a Starsky and Hutch where a cop dies and they find out after the fact that he was gay, and they're wrestling not with a little bit with, what does this change about our opinion of him, but also with, why couldn't he tell us? What did we do
Mm.
that made him not comfortable telling us? But then Reagan won the election for president of the United States in a landslide, and a lot
Mm.
of TV executives thought, oh, the country must be more conservative than we thought. We must pull back. And actually, we're going to be more cautious
Mm,
about how we touch any gay topics.
right.
And so we had that backwards feel. Same thing
I
with how
feel.
women characters portrayed, how black characters were portrayed. Things went backwards and then they went forwards, and then something happened to us again that like several things happened to us that we went backwards again with some. Um, because I mean, like 90s, you were having uh these great women characters of Ripley and Sarah Connor
Mhm,
and Gina Davis in The Long Kiss Goodnight, which I have such great affection for.
mm,
And then 10 years later, it was hard to sell on any of that because it's just like, oh, well, women really don't go to action. Yes, of course they do. What are you talking about? So
right.
comic books are sort of a similar thing, but it's one thing I will say that it's very clear is that uh, mainstream comics, by which I mean Marvel and DC,
Mhm,
uh, have lost a lot of counterculture edge. That's
mm,
not to say that you don't have storytellers who are able to give really hard-hitting stories and really positive stories. Those 30s and 40s, it was sort of general pop culture, and then 60s, 70s, 80s, you had sort of this counterculture slash almost a punk rock appeal
mm,
to it, where they were really just trying out, which is sort of funny because a lot of the creators at that point were, you know, 30-year-old men to 40-year-old men who it's not like they were rocking out at
right.
the clubs and listening to the latest music. But there was a bit more of an experimental energy there,
Mm,
and some of them really wanted to tackle into the social issues to try and tap into. You suddenly had people wondering, should Green Lantern be worrying about the alien invader or should he be looking at housing crisis and
right.
what are the landlords actually doing? Which also was part of Superman's appeal in 1938,
Mhm,
and he was the creation of two Depression era kids.
right.
Um, there's there's less censorship on several things now in terms of what you can and can't show, but I think there's also sometimes less daring of what they're putting out. A lot of superhero comics now are relying on an audience that is already built in for the past 15, 20 years and
Right.
such. So you're getting sequels to things that happened in 1995 and 2005.
So I do want to talk about mainstream comics in a minute because
Mhm.
we talked before about Harley Quinn, and like there's definitely some mainstream comic book characters that are really exploring their mental health.
Yeah.
But I also want to talk about for people who didn't realize that there is a comic book world outside of DC and Marvel,
Mm.
like what is there any characters in those other more like independent comic books that are really exploring mental health in an important way?
Oh, certainly. Image is technically a big publisher, but Image is not quite like Marvel and DC. It's not a shared universe mostly, and Image is where certain folks have brought their own creative owned ideas
Mhm,
to an amazing venue, an amazing playground. The Walking Dead was published by Image, and whatever opinions you have about how the comic evolved or what the franchise as a whole became, and the start off with the show and then the show went into its own direction, has had all these spin-offs. The fact is, throughout that whole saga, the creator Robert Kirkman is the architect,
mm,
is the final say, and so there isn't an overarching sort of Marvel overlord saying, "Okay, well, you can do this, but in 2 years, we have to revert back to status quo because the next Avengers movie is out."
right,
Um,
right.
you don't have that, and so you have such wonderful stories there, like I Kill Giants,
Mhm,
I think is an amazing story, by Joe Kelly and, J.M. Ken Nimura, uh, which is really about dealing with fear
mm,
and grief.
mm,
There is a child who you're seeing from her point of view several times. So at first it seems like, oh, this could be that classic. The child has magic and is fighting magical things, and just no one knows it, but we know it. At a certain point, you quickly realize, oh no, there actually is no giants or fairy
Mm.
folk in this world. It is a coping mechanism. She will not deal with a situation happening regarding with her family,
Right.
and has gone full barrel into this,
Mhm.
to the point where when characters are talking to her and saying, "Barbara, you haven't even talked about," and then part of their dialogue is sharpied out because Barbara won't hear it, so you can't hear it.
Mhm. Interesting.
And you see how that, it and on one hand, it seems at first she's having this adventure, like, okay, so she's giving herself an escapist fantasy, and maybe that's healthy. But at a certain point, no, it's not, because she's looking for reasons to hold on to anger,
Mhm.
and she's not processing anything, so she starts attacking people who are generally trying to help her, and not even realizing she's attacking them. She hits her friend at one point out of defense and then realizes what's happened, but she still hit her.
Right.
And it's a very raw, beautifully illustrated story, that I think anyone can relate to, and is just about like that. You have to ground yourself at a certain point. Escapism is great, but you have to ground yourself before you just spin and spiral out,
Mhm.
and serve nothing. At a certain point, it's just denial.
Mhm. Yeah. I think that one of the reasons that um, comic books have thrived so much is because they are giving a voice and giving people who sometimes feel like they're not heard a platform for them to like understand themselves and the world. Like I think that, you know, um like going to Comic-Con for me is one of the best experiences for me to just watch people and to, experience the joy and excitement of this comic book community that feels like the only time that they are home and able to fully express themselves is like at that weekend in San Diego. And I think that like it just illustrates this um the fact that like everyone finds in comics a part of themselves that is being, shared with the world. And so I'm curious, like, if someone is listening to this and they're like, wow, I didn't, realize about all of these, characters that are outside the DC and Marvel universe. Outside of Image, what are some other like comic book houses or whatever that people could like, die like, someone literally go to Google and be like, "Comic book character that struggles with depression," and see what comes up. Because I think that, like, it's important for us to, like, find these stories that relate to us and, like, what we're going through right now.
Yeah, it's you can definitely find, lots of top 10 lists of, non-Marvel and DC comic book publishers, or non-Marvel and DC comic book, great comic book stories, or
Yeah.
non-superhero great comic book stories. I mean, one of my favorite comics was from, years back, Kitchen Sink Press. They made The Crow, and eventually Image started publishing The Crow, but it started off with Kitchen Sink Press, and it was something that happened over the course of years. It wasn't a monthly series. It was partially dependent on James O'Barr, who was writing it, being emotionally available
Mhm.
to continue the story. It was based on the loss. Like, James O'Barr had such a hard life,
Mhm.
basically starting from birth, honestly.
Mhm.
Um, he himself has talked about he's not sure of his actual birthday
Mhm.
because his mother, was drunk, and just knew that it happened in between Christmas and New Year, and he had this rough life where, and I say, I relate to him a little bit when he was talking about it one time. There are times, like, I've looked back on, videos of me as a kid, and some of them are very sweet in that way that videos of you as a kid are, and some of them frustrate me so much because it's so clear to me now, this kid has ADHD
Mhm.
and is overwhelmed,
Mhm.
and you're asking him to do something without understanding what he's going through. You're basically asking him to just assimilate and mask, and
Right.
he's gonna learn it,
Right.
and he's gonna learn it too well sometimes, and then he's gonna take years trying to undo that and try to, like, actually be himself and not be the extroverted idea he's supposed to be.
Right.
why don't you see that?
Mhm.
And James O'Barr talked about how, he, because he was more introverted, because he was slow, because he was more artistic minded. He actually at one point was believed to just have a learning disability, and they put him in this other class, and he didn't. But they just didn't take the time to understand him, and he grew up and he fell in love, and then that love was lost, and to a tragic death, and so he made The Crow, and it is a violent story. It is a revenge driven story in itself. But 90s kid me loved seeing that there was also a beauty in it and its artwork, and in how it talked about love in a not resentful way, despite the pain love it caused.
Yeah.
Um, there are lots of other comic books out there. Strangers in Paradise, I have often used as an introduction for people who are curious about the medium of comics, but have no interest in superheroes.
Mm.
Strangers in Paradise starts off as just two women living together, Kachu and Francine, and it is a complicated relationship because they love each other and they have this intense friendship, but maybe there's romantic love too. Certainly for one of them, there is,
Mm.
but also that person has a past that she both doesn't want to expose, but also has never made peace with. And as the story evolves, it gets bigger in its scope. There's government agents and there's mobsters and hitmen and stuff like that. So it goes into some like adventure territory, but the heart of it is still these two women and a couple other characters that come into their lives, and how complicated love is and how
Mm.
complicated friendship is, but also how beautiful the core of it can just be simply, I am here for you,
Mhm.
no matter what you're going through, no matter where you came from, what you think you have to make up for in your
Right.
past. I'm here for you.
Mm.
And seeing them all have to learn to grow, not just with each other, but for themselves, that aching for maturity and for being able to, you can't always forgive yourself for things you've done in the past, but you can accept it as that's done.
Right.
So I adore Strangers in Paradise by Terry Moore. It's been published a few different ways over the years, but you can find all of it now collected. And they've got omnibuses that are numbered very conveniently for you, so you know where to start. And it's, yeah, I recommend that wholeheartedly. Um, there's also a few titles out there. Sex Criminals is not necessarily my cup of tea, but I appreciate it very much, and has to do with two people who sort of feel freakish about certain things that happen with them during sex and how they
Mm.
relate to the world, and then they find someone who seems to match the same way, and you follow this really intense romance, but also are very well aware this might not be the healthiest romance, so
Mm.
maybe this romance will run its course, even if there's so much coming out of it right now. Like maybe they will mature,
Yeah.
and maybe they won't, and we'll just have to be okay with that and go a different way. And it's very ambiguous for a long time about which way it's going to go.
Mm.
So
Interesting.
yeah, there are lots of stories out there. Also just graphic novels that are just done in one. The Elegy for Amelia Johnson,
Mm.
which is about two friends engaging in grief. It's there's a whole world out there. It's comic books when they started. I won't go in too much into this history part of it, but like when they started, it was just pop culture.
Mhm.
It there was radio and there's comics and there's movies, and that's kind of it. Obviously, there's books, but because of that, there was no idea of a genre in comics. There were romance comics and there were Western comics and there were cartoon funny animal comics and there were adventure comics and sci-fi comics. And somewhere along the line, it started getting smaller. And then the 50s, along with other things, one that brought huge censorship, it also started bringing in this idea of comic books are for boys because otherwise they confuse gender roles for girls and give them
Right.
ideas they shouldn't be having.
Of course.
And then it started shrinking further as like so many things were just not making money, and now television was becoming more common and all this stuff. it started becoming even more focused to superhero
Mhm.
and specific types of sci-fi and fantasy, to the point where you almost get fooled into thinking that comic book is a genre, and it's not. It's a medium.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. So, jumping now to DC and Marvel, um, maybe if we want to talk about like the top three characters that explore mental health in some
Oh,
capacity. And we can start with Harley Quinn if you want, because I know that, we've talked about that before.
yeah, Harley. I don't know if there are top characters because it if a character's been around long enough, someone's tackling it with
Totally.
these characters.
Yeah.
Maybe not as much with Booster Gold, but the yeah, and it's also sometimes it's sadly it can be done terribly. If you look at the whole history of Moon Knight, who actually I think was handled with great care in the Disney Plus series,
Mm.
but in the comics, some writers have really tried to delve into the character psychology, and some writers have been happy to just say, "Well, he's crazy." And look
Mm.
at the crazy things that he thinks. He's Spider-Man this issue. Holy, and it doesn't work and is actually very insulting.
Yeah.
But with Harley Quinn, yeah, what a ride she's been.
Mm.
She was created. It's funny to think now. A lot of people can be surprised she wasn't a staple of the comics
Mhm.
originally, or even until about 1999. She was introduced in the Batman cartoon series, Batman the Animated Series, and was partially inspired by Paul Dini, one of the two showrunners and head writers, watching a daytime soap and seeing actor Arlene Sorkin in a jester costume.
Mhm.
And they'd been talking about upcoming Joker stories, and he thought, oh, it'd be fun if the Joker sort of had a little sidekick, like a themed sidekick for this adventure. And Arlene Sorkin provided the voice. And so you have that, hello, Mr. J. And she's sort of this, starts off as an echo of the mobster's girlfriend trope that had
Mm.
been in so many gangster films and cartoons that were slightly inspired by Dick Tracy, where it's just she's this young woman who doesn't understand that the bad boy is not the best partner, and
Right.
she's here, da da da. But they gave her a little more sprinkling. They gave her acrobatic abilities. They started bringing, because they liked using her. Paul Dini and the rest would use her in more episodes, and she started becoming the muscle, because which actually worked really well because traditionally Joker is not a fighter. So
Mm.
it's not terribly interesting to have him physically fight against Batman once the plot's been revealed and his plans have been foiled. But if you have Harley join in, well, now this is kind of fun because Batman's stronger, but Harley's more agile, and she's
Right.
got this great energy to her character. And there was sort of a one-up joke at one point where Robin is thinking about how seemingly crazy Harley is, and asks, what was she even before this? And Batman briefly mentions, I think they originally called it a psychoanalyst. It's
Mm.
it's later decided that she is a psychologist. But that led into first a comic book taking place in the canon of the cartoon called Mad Love, and then an episode based on that, where you delved into, this is a woman who had ambition and was already doing some unhealthy things. She
Mhm.
she would, part of her ambition would involve the manipulation of others
Mm.
to get, not just, she could get good grades herself, she could do the work, she was smart, but she wanted this grading, and she wanted that position, and she wanted
Right.
that door open for her. So, and then she winds up at Arkham Asylum, not necessarily to reach these people or gain a greater understanding for them. It's gaining a greater understanding is a means to an end.
Mhm.
There is an appeal here. It's very fascinating to talk to the Joker as opposed to some other poor guy who killed a bunch of people. So let's get here. And the Joker manipulates her by seemingly opening up. And rather than see this as a red flag, like, she wants to believe, oh, I'm so good, I'm reaching him.
Mhm.
And that gets manipulated. And eventually she develops this toxic love for him
Hmm.
and becomes retroactively the explanation of how often the Joker's escaped from
Hmm.
Arkham Asylum, that she's been helping him for a while until she finally decides to take a direct role and become not Dr. Harleen Quinzel, but Harley Quinn.
Yep.
I think that's so interesting because they could have just easily given an origin of he met this mobster's girlfriend, he doused her with Joker gas, it drove her nuts, now she's Harley.
Right.
But they didn't. They went into even if you bring in the Joker's manipulation, a lot of this is choice, and a lot of this is ignoring red flags, and a lot of this is part of an already established pattern of behavior on Harley's part
Right.
of just bad decisions.
Yeah.
And
So she's kind of a
and
warning character.
yeah, yeah. And I mean, and you see her a couple times in the cartoons even trying to leave the Joker. She shacks up with Poison Ivy for a bit, or she does her own brand of chaos, or she actively tries to kill the Joker. And then the one sliver of the Joker is saying, "Oh, you're right, I miss you." It's like, "Oh, I miss you too." Okay. And and it's just which later comics and later cartoons expanded further about, well, where did she come from? And it goes into that, neglected children who feel like they have to prove their love
Right.
and their value to their own parents will sometimes be overwhelmed with the slightest validation on someone they're hoping for that for, or the same way some of us, and I've been here, some of us will develop feelings for someone who is emotionally unavailable,
Mm.
and we have repeated signs of that. But then when there's the sign of possible availability and possible reciprocation, we latch onto that,
Mm.
not looking at, okay, but look at the pattern, look at the chaos. Like you can't just like gather each of these bits
Hmm.
of goodness and keep them together, and that makes a whole relationship.
Right.
But you sort of have it in your brain that you can, if you just collect enough, it'll be okay.
Right.
And I've been there, and it sucks, and it doesn't help anyone.
Yeah.
And I think with Harley, then it got evolved. It's funny in the comics when they brought her in, they also had to give her some enhanced abilities because it's like, well, comic book Joker is a little deadlier than cartoon Joker and would probably just try to kill her or gas her at some point. So how did he not do that? And they're like, well, because Poison Ivy becomes her friend and gives her these chemical treatments that enhance her agility, enhance her resistance to injury, and make her immune to a lot of toxins.
Hmm.
Um, so she also has that added like semi superpowered benefit in the comics. Despite like the despite all this, it's so interesting to me that DC had the courage to allow her to go into a new path. That
Right.
eventually, in all incarnations of Harley, she does leave. Maybe with the exception of the original Batman the animated series canon. But in the Harley Quinn cartoon, which is brilliant, in the live action movies, in the mainstream DC comics, even with their reboots that they occasionally have, Harley leaves. And it doesn't turn her into a completely different character.
Mm.
She's still Harley. She's
Right.
still oddball. She's still chaos energy. But now she's loving herself for it while trying to be herself in the shadow of Joker's approval.
Right.
And that's so interesting to me that we got to have that balance, that it didn't become, well, now she becomes a superhero and she's totally against her old behavior. No, like some of those were her choices.
Yeah.
And yeah, and I think that's because and that's so great because it could have become victim blaming. You chose this, so you have to suffer or anything, but it actually becomes a reminder of agency. If you chose this, if you chose to join with the Joker and start wearing that Jester costume, you
Right.
can choose to leave and be the next version of you that's coming.
Right. Yeah. I mean, with all comic books and, what you just relayed about Harley, like there's such a relatability to the characters, but also just like heightened, like whatever their experience is, a
Yes.
heightened experience from something that we might experience. But I think that
Yeah.
that's helpful for people to see how that gets played out, what the consequences could potentially be. Like, what
Uh,
those red flags will lead to, all those sorts of things.
and that's melodrama. That's the
Totally.
beauty of that's theater.
Mhm.
Shakespeare could have talked about how sometimes we need to get over ourselves and just talk to the girl we like, talk to the boy we like, talk to whoever, talk to our father about our feelings and say, this is where I'm living, this is where I make a stand. Or he could do it as, well, Puck got involved and the fairy folk did a thing and his
Right.
head became a donkey and
Right.
it's all, but it's the same lessons.
Yeah.
And and it's all Grant Morrison, who's one of my favorite writers, and I've had the joy of being able to talk with them a few times.
Mhm.
Um, Grant always said, the relatability is always there if you just break it down. Like, is Batman fighting crazy people, or is he fighting people who represent ways he could go too far?
Mm.
And is he fighting the psychological illnesses and toxic attitudes he needs to watch out for and avoid?
Mm.
And Superman, yes, has this demigod level of power, but also, when he was a kid, he was lonely until he had a dog,
Right.
and he needed his friends to hang out with on the weekends. Those friends were time travelers with superpowers, but we all have that crew from summer camp or from the comic book store or from the skateboarding park, like, who's like, oh, they get me, and I can only see them every 2 months, but they get me.
Right.
You know,
Absolutely. You know, you mentioned Batman and Superman, and both of them. I want to talk about masks and how that's a big part of something that I like to talk about is like the different masks that we wear, the different ways we show up in society, depending upon the people that we're surrounded with. Um, yeah, whether or not it is your group of people or if it's a more formal situation that you have to act in a certain way, and that kind of thing. I'm curious, like, the origin of masks, which we could go back to, theater, like kabuki theater, where we've got masks and, stuff like that. But like in comics, did superhero characters always wear masks? And why? Just to be hidden from people knowing who they were, or was there like some other reason for that?
so it starts off with the characters that I tend to think of as the proto superheroes,
Mhm.
um, because by our definition of the term superhero, which does involve not only wearing a mask and fighting villains, but wearing a mask and fighting a cause as opposed to one villain.
Uh-huh.
Uh, like, it's not just this one guy killed my father and after he's done, I'm done. Like, no, it's crime
Mhm.
is the enemy.
Right.
Helping people, not just helping me regain my throne,
Mhm.
is the goal. That's what differentiates the superhero from, you know, the main guy, and but also that there is an impossible level of technology and or ability there, whether that's magic, whether that's Kryptonian science, whether it's the fact that Batman has, you know, all this technology that's available to him and that only James Bond would also have.
Right.
It's there's an impossible level there involved. The characters before that, the original version of the Shadow, the Green Hornet, the Scarlet Pimpernel, Dr. Sin, the Scarecrow, Zorro, are all in a much more grounded reality.
Mm.
You have a much more limited, both world and also scope of the mission. And there are characters that, of course, influence them. And there's in 1832 by Thomas de Quincey a Gothic novel called Klosterheim or The Mask,
Mm.
and it involved a prince trying to take back a city and wearing this mask, this Mardi Gras mask, as he did so, basically. And it wasn't a hugely popular story by itself, but it was one of those that like inspires some folks so that later you have in 1840 the first stories of Spring Hill Jack, the play Spring Hill Jack starts getting published. Spring Hill Jack was an urban legend in
Mm.
England about someone who was messing. with people and then would somehow like leap away like at an impossible height or vanish into the shadows. And so based on this urban legend, we made Spring Hill Jack. And he had the author had the idea of it's just a guy in fancy dress
Mm.
using magician's tricks. And you know, you go further then and we have the Scarlet Pimpernel, who is wearing a metaphorical mask. In the original book, The Scarlet Pimpernel in 1909, no, sorry, 1905, by Baroness Emma Orczy, our hero Percy Blakeney is leading a double life, but you know, while the Scarlet Pimpernel is a master of disguises, he doesn't have a set costume or a set disguise. It's the true mask is the fact that in his personal life he acts like a fop who's so interested in fashion, not interested in politics, and hides how multi-skilled he is.
Mm.
And that is such an ember that gets borrowed and expanded. It's immediately borrowed by Russell Thorndike, who in 1915 writes Dr. Sin or the Scarecrow of Romney Marsh. And in that, you have the first in literature truly costumed proto superhero. It's this vicar, Dr. Christopher Sin, who you learn was a pirate for a while and has left that life behind. But England government is doing what England government does. People are getting taxed in wrong ways. People are suffering. He's going to protect his parishioners. He's going to help them smuggle because at that time, smuggling is how you keep the family alive and keep the community alive. So he puts on a scarecrow costume.
Mm.
And as the scarecrow is helping the smugglers and terrifying the British and puts on all these magician's tricks to seem supernatural. And that tale and Scarlet Pimpernel get combined and retold 4 years later in 1919 as Zorro.
Mm.
The mask, no, actually, the mark of Zorro, originally entitled Curse of the Capistrano.
Mm.
And Zorro starts setting up the archetype of this masked and slightly larger than life
Right.
crime fighter.
Mhm.
He still has a limited thing. He's trying to free Los Angeles and in the initial story, he's ready to retire at the end. Like, cool, I took out the corrupt mayor.
Right.
We're good.
Mhm.
But eventually other things keep bringing him out of retirement and he does that stuff. It sort of led into this idea of it was taking in the Western idea
Mm.
of you're not getting enough help from the police or from those in authority, but one man with the skill can
Right.
stand up and
Right.
do this. And the fact that you're adding a mask to it, like, oh, the drama now, because
Yep.
now there's drama even if he's not fighting, because what if his girl finds out? Oh no. And like all this stuff would come from that. So that it just started as like this idea of it allows for dramatic tension even without action scenes. It
Mhm.
also is a great visual element as pulp magazines started rising, which is sort of the predecessor to superhero comics. They were these anthology magazines printed on pulp paper because someone figured out that's way cheap to print. And you had the Shadow there.
Mm.
And you had Doc Savage, the Man of Bronze, who didn't wear a mask, but was this like globe-trotting adventurer. And you had the radio shows, and it was so cooler to have a radio show when the advertisement didn't just show another guy in a tie and
Right.
telling you he's a detective. No, this is the Green Hornet. Look at his mask.
Right.
Oh, you know drama is happening here. Oh, even
Right.
his valet wears a mask. Oh my God.
Yeah.
Kato, the Man in Black. And so you had that. And then it's so interesting that because Superman had it and Superman became so influential and had such a ripple effect on comic books, there were parts of his makeup that just got accepted as this is the standard. And even if we deviate from it, he's what we're building off of.
Mhm.
But ironically, Superman again goes with the Scarlet Pimpernel idea
Mhm.
that the mask is metaphorical.
Yeah.
Um, and that was partly that was Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, who created the character, were glasses wearing nerds
Mm.
and had trouble with confidence several times. Later on, Jerry Siegel becomes too confident, and sadly, it helped him lose the rights to Superman and prevent himself from getting much more money than he would have otherwise.
Mm.
Um, they are guys who have this idea of, we're not popular, we're not, we don't feel as really special, but if people could see past what they're judging on the
Mm.
surface level, if they could see me not just as the glasses wearing guy in the tie, if they saw what's underneath, they would know, like, no, I've got something here.
Yeah.
And so you have Clark having that great visual of taking off the glasses, letting his hair go loose instead of
Right.
slicked all the way back, taking off the shirt,
Mhm.
and here I am. So you've got like Clark, he at work has to be a certain way,
Right.
but then when his particular skill set is called on, throws off the outfit. Here I am, bold. I'm not slinking in the shadows. Like I'm wearing colors that are calling attention to letting you know exactly what I am. I am this larger than life,
Right.
weird combination of John Carter of Mars and Hercules that's
Mhm.
now fighting not just mad scientists, but corrupt landlords. And the first issue, I'm going to stop a guy beating his wife, which
Mm.
is groundbreaking for the time, sadly. And later comics have had to deal with, there's this wrestling with realism with superheroes because there are
Yeah.
folks who want to really, because certain characters lend themselves to more realistic portrayals. There was this attitude of all characters should, and I absolutely disagree with that. And a lot of comic book writers and characters behind some of those stories, David Mazzucchelli, who was the artist behind Batman Year One, which really grounded Batman into a very realistic seeming Chicago world, like making Gotham City more like 1940 Chicago
Mm.
and making it like very, very human and inspiring how certain films would later portray Batman.
Right.
And that worked. It's an entertaining story. But even David Mazzucchelli brought up later when some people were like, yeah, every comic book should be like not just like Batman Year One, but it should be even more realistic than that. It should be more like the supervillains should actually just be gangsters with nicknames. It shouldn't be supervillains. And just to clarify for anyone who's thinking like, but the glasses aren't really a mask. Like, well, there are lots of in the comics, Superman like wears clothes as Clark that don't quite fit. They give a different impression of his body. He has studied body language and acting techniques, so he gives himself different body language. He stoops.
Mhm.
He because he's Superman and has such muscle control that he can both crush concrete and also give you a hug without killing you. He
Right.
can also alter his voice. The original Superman actor, Bud Collyer, was a trained singer and would do that for the
Mm.
radio show and the movie serial, shifting from Clark to Superman and back by going up and down a few octaves.
Right.
And so there's all that, and the glasses change the color of his eyes slightly, and all these other things. But the more important thing is why mask Clark? Why not mask Superman? And in this scene from Jeff Johns, Clark talks about I thought about giving Clark Kent up completely
Mm.
because my power is so much shouldn't I be helping people all the time? But I like being Clark Kent. I like who I am. I like who my parents were. I like who I grew up to be. And then I thought about wearing a mask like Bruce does. But as close as we are, Batman is going for something different than I am. I would rather good people trust me than bad people fear me.
Mm.
I think they need to see your eyes to do that. So Clark wears a mask
Interesting.
instead of Superman. And I mean and I love that explanation. I also prefer the writers and artists who make Clark Kent a disguise, but an honest disguise,
Mm.
where Clark does not say anything Superman doesn't believe. He's just not going to get physically confrontational. And how he speaks about things is more vulnerable and meek, but
Right.
he's not outright lying or satirizing himself.
Right.
Superman is who he is at one job, and Clark is who he is at a different job.
Yep.
And those who are trusted get to know the character in between. I
Right.
also prefer that style with Bruce Wayne. Like there's the facade he puts on for his socializing. There's the dark, vengeful, demonic Dark Knight that he puts on to scare people. But Alfred and Superman and Diana, like they get to know the person between. That's the real person.
Right.
And I think if you don't have that, then that to me is the realism. Let's get to the emotional truth of it.
Yeah.
And how that can weigh on you and that can be tiring because
Yeah.
that's one thing. Again, like the superhero identity was great for drama without action scenes, but as people got older and as the stories got more sophisticated, it started becoming kind of nuts because then it's unhealthy. Like it's unhealthy if you don't have anyone you're trusting your life with.
Right.
You don't have to come out of the closet to your parents or at work, but someone has to know who you are.
Right.
And the past 20 years, especially with television shows like the CW DC shows, has really changed things where I think they realize that because it's,
Yeah.
Flash is interesting, but Flash is more interesting if we also have three friends that he can just talk to.
Right. Be themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just healthier. Like there's superheroes can screw up and there can be anxieties about who's going to be in danger or what do I judge and stuff. But for one thing, you have to show a maturity happening or else it becomes very stale. And the other
Yeah.
thing is, I think we have a better attitude now as a society that actually keeping information from people does not protect them. Letting them have the information helps protect them better.
Yeah. That's so interesting. So I have two final questions that I like to wrap things up with.
Sure.
And the first one is going back to masks. And I'm wondering if there's any situation that or a memory or an experience that you've had where you have purposefully put on or taken off a mask, if there's something that you would be willing to share.
Oh yeah. I mean, I had a while where I was burning out
Mm,
and it led unfortunately to me being insensitive to some people in ways I wasn't seeing. Or just, outright a jerk to them. And a couple of them I apologized to, a couple of them I didn't know I had to apologize to, but it wasn't really that's my responsibility. I should have known. I should have been more aware of myself. But when it was becoming apparent that I wasn't dealing with something well,
mm,
I didn't have time to deal with it well, I thought.
mm,
Enough time to take the time to address this and everything. So what I've got to do is pretend everything's okay right now
right.
until I can have the chance to have that week, to have whatever I needed. So go to the convention and be convention Allen
Hmm.
and tell your charming stories and tell a few jokes and then at a certain point tell people, well, hey, I'd love to stay here, but I gotta go. Not because you actually did, but because you don't have the energy for it. So yeah, there were times like and of course that doesn't really work at a certain
Mm,
point.
yeah.
And I believe in aspiration. Masks can be so tiring. If I put on masks now, it's more of a I'm currently upset and I know I have to process that. But right now we've got a meeting or something. So I'm not gonna like not process this. I just have to put that aside, get through this, and then tonight we are processing this, whatever.
Right.
So in that sense, it can be helpful. It was
Hmm.
really just, I can't deal with my problems. I'm going to mask until they go away. Like that's not helpful.
Right.
And and yeah, it really sucks. I used to mask with automatic, like wasn't even thinking about it with
Mhm.
anytime I went home to DC because
Is where your family lives.
yeah, and because again, like I was aware um my path is both not a path they understand and not a path they want for me. I'm
Right.
supposed to be in law school and I'm not.
Yeah.
And so we had that where I just this is the mask for my family because I don't want to deal with disappointment. I don't want to deal with having to explain the explanation, all that stuff. Now we're much better and I will call my parents sometimes. There are things I know they're not going to get.
Sure.
I'm not gonna delve into that, but I will actually, like, share details of my life on,
Mm,
like, a weekly basis, which 20-year-old me would find absolutely a absurd. And I also, like, I used to mask some body behavior because I grew up in the DC area, went to an all-guys private school where,
mm,
again, there was a lot of, like, little things that I didn't realize until years later piled up. But one of them was also the rampant homophobia that that can be in the DC area and again in a all guys private school in the 1990s. And I didn't realize for years how often I was still masking some of my body language.
Yeah.
and making sure I didn't seem at times effeminate or anything, because high school had taught me like you better mask that or you're going to get your ass kicked.
Yeah.
Um, and just became autonomic. And I'm very well aware of the energy I don't put into that now.
Yeah. Well, I'm very grateful that you're so open and honest with your community and your friends now. I really respect you and admire our, friendship. And I think that you have so much to offer. And I'm glad that you feel like you can be your true self um in a lot of these spaces. So I'm really, really grateful for that. Um The final question is if you have any, I created More Than You See to really focus on non-traditional mental health tools so that people can have their own self-awareness and then create their own mental health toolbox. So I'm curious if you have a tool or something that you do on a daily basis in order to, work through your own anxiety, stresses, anything like that.
I have one is I keep a little Superman piece of art. You can actually you can see it on Zoom behind me.
Mhm.
Um, of him sort of bursting out of the ground, flying upwards in the classic Superman pose.
Yeah.
And next to it is a picture of Death from Terry Pratchett's Discworld.
Mm.
And in front of my door to leave is a poster I made of Paddington Bear saying a few things of
Uh-huh.
affirmation. And these are all collective reminders to me of there are enough stories about hope in the face of darkness
Mhm.
that can't be an accident, that can't be so many delusional people.
Right.
Like, if those stories keep happening, if they happen from different corners of the world by different people for different audiences, and the common thread one of the common threads is you are stronger than you think.
Mhm.
There has to be a truth in that. This other thing that I think is actually bigger than superheroes, but goes behind the heart of storytelling, the oratorio by Pico, um, Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, and it's a manifesto of Renaissance thought.
Mhm.
And anyone can look it up. You can read it, but the basic idea, one of the basic ideas, is you as a human being are the ultimate adaptable creature.
Mhm.
Like, the fish does not see the bird and figure out how can I make a flying machine, but we
Right.
did.
Mhm.
And we figured out the stars, and we figured out how to go to space. We figured out how to join the fish and even go deeper than that fish did to meet the other fish down here who didn't even know we existed.
Mhm.
You are this product of alchemy and imagination and power. And if humanity is naturally able to adapt and imitate other things to enhance itself, then Pico argued we can imitate angels,
Mhm.
which metaphorically is just our higher selves. If you just look at what your higher self is and go for it and imitate it and adapt towards it, like, eventually you'll get there. Even if you only get halfway there, what an amazing journey that is.
Right.
So I think that's ultimately the mental health
Mhm.
aspiration of
Yeah.
storytelling and particularly of superheroes.
Yeah. That's amazing. What a perfect way to end because I think that, you really just illustrated the fact that superheroes so much are exaggerating what we are, you
Yeah.
know, kind of going through in society. But as humans, we also have immense potential.
Yeah.
And we sometimes don't see that or go after that. And it's kind of a aspirational reminder that we can, and, if we're feeling up to it, we should. Um, so thank you for that reminder.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being here. I just adore you and your incredible brain, and I'm so happy I could share it with everyone.
I am very flattered to be here. I've gotten uh I joke that I've gotten more introverted and shy in my old age and nervous. I'm not always the best voice for certain things that surely there are other people, but I very much appreciate being asked to be on this, and of course I'm always happy to lend anything I can to you because I adore you and I love you and I appreciate your friendship over the years.
Well, thank you, Alan. We'll talk to you
All right.
soon.
Bye bye.
Thanks again so much for listening to this episode of the More Than You See podcast. If there's a specific comic book character that you want us to dive into in the future, please let me know. You can always reach out to me through Instagram or through the links in my show notes. I would be happy to have Alan back to talk about a specific comic book character that relates to you in some capacity and you could learn a little bit more about them. I would also invite you to share, subscribe, write us a little reviewy thing. Any of those kinds of things really do help spread the word of mouth. And it is my goal to try and bring my voice and the voice of my guests and the voice of this community to as many people as possible. That being said, thank you so much for being part of this community. Please be kind to yourself this week. Please remember that you and everyone around you is more than you see. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next week.